Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy for Nerds by Nerds. Today I'm joined by Thilo Graff and Douglas Niles. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Very good, Dave. Thanks for having me.
I'm
Absolutely
super
amazing.
excited to have both of you guys on. I've been a big fan of Douglas of your work for a long time. I mean, I read so many of your books in my teenage years, which is super awesome to get to meet you virtually here in person. And also, it's also nice to have you on as well, Thyla. Both of you are working on a project together for AAW. Uh, and it is on Kickstarter right now, which there are links in the description to check out for a Spelunking, a D&D Spelunking book. So, how did you guys get involved with that project?
Well, I was a latecomer to the project. I was invited by Stephen. Is it Yardley? Is that his last name?
Yearly, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think I gather that he was the director of the project. He wasn't one of the writers, but at least I gathered that some of the inspiration came from this book that I have brought along to show, the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide that I wrote in the mid '80s, and really tried to emphasize the underground aspects of playing D&D. And I included things in there about natural caves, spelunking skills, and trying to relate a lot of that to dungeon crawling, which seems obviously is very relevant. And I think that that my connection to that is what caused Stephen to ask me to be involved. And I have been a long time out of the game design business, so my what do I want to say? My contributions, were more along the narrative storytelling line, and I hope that livens up the book so that it becomes kind of a fun read in addition to a valuable game asset. And I really enjoyed the stuff that I worked on, but I have to say I didn't have a lot to do with the actual game mechanics. Thilo was very much involved in that.
Yeah. So for me personally, it was like I was talking with Jonathan and Stephen, and we were reminiscing about our all-time favorite role-playing game supplements, regardless of system. And there was this one common touchstone that we three had in common, and that was the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide. And we were talking and saying like, okay, we absolutely adore this book, and it's timeless, and it still works. And sometime later, Jonathan contacted me and told me, hey, Tilo, would you like to write a kind of sequel to this book? And I was like, I was shocked and kind of flabbergasted at first, because for me personally, the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide is one of the best role-playing game books that have been written. It's timeless. I still use it in pretty much all of my games that I'm running. So I was sitting there and I was like, okay, how do you write a sequel to that? And for a second we contemplated, okay, we'll update it to 5th edition. But then I was like, that's useless. Plus, I don't want to invalidate Douglas Niles' legendary work. This book still works. You can still use it. All of the content is still relevant. So why just update it? And so what I wanted to do with the rules in the book was to create essentially a companion tome, a complementary tome. And I was really inspired by Doug's design aesthetics back in the day, by their timeless quality. That is what I tried to duplicate in the Survivalist Guide to Spelunking. So I wrote the rules, particularly for 5e, but with an eye, and a very distinct eye, towards the rules being able to be easily adapted to whatever system you want to play. If you want to play AD&D, you can adapt the rules. If you want to play Dungeon Crawl Classics or Pathfinder or D&D 6th edition, whenever that comes out, you'll be able to adapt these rules to these respective systems. And if you have any problems whatsoever, you can just contact me, because I've got more than 5,000 reviews under my belt and I play a ton of different role-playing games. So if you need help with the math and how do I convert XYZ to this system, there's a pretty damn good chance I can help you.
That's great.
So, Douglas, what was it like writing the first book? Like, now I can't even fathom now, because everything is so easy. We have like all the information of humanity with a little sorting, sifting, and sorting through at our fingertips compared to when you originally wrote that. Were you already an expert spelunker?
No, I've had minimal. I have been in caves, but I've never done it with gear and, rappelled down cliffs or crawled through dank passages. I like caves, but I'm more the guy that likes to stay upright and kind of stay dry.
Yeah. So what was your process for like researching those kind of books back in the day?
Well, a lot of it was library research. And that's, let's see, there were a couple of aspects. One of the things that I think is notable, and I have to give excellent game cartographer Dave Sutherland credit, was in the back of Dungeoneer's Survival Guide, there's a series of examples and then a process outline for how you can draw three-dimensional maps, like of a castle, say, or a dungeon complex, where you're trying to map out all the levels, but also show them in relationship to each other, instead of just having page 1 as the first level, page 2 is, and so on. And Dave was a staff. He's passed away, unfortunately, since then, but he was a staff artist and map drawer for our game modules. And the first time I saw him use that, I think the first time any of us on staff saw it, was when he helped Tracy Hickman create a very memorable vampire module. What was it called? Ravenloft.
Yeah.
Which was hugely popular, and he used those maps to draw the castle as basically one page, where you could see a cutaway view of the castle and see how the floor layouts worked in relationship to each other. And so Dave coached me a lot in terms of writing the mapping portion of Dungeoneer's Survival Guide. So getting back to your where did I learn some of this question? Part of it was from the guy who was helping me draw the maps. He was really good, not just at doing that, but at teaching me how to do it. And what I tried to do in the book is to teach dungeon masters how to do it when they're and we included templates, that you can photocopy and modify. And so that's a big part of this book. Another part of it, this was I think this is before second edition came out, if I recall correctly. So AD&D first edition was kind of being outgrown. It is obviously the founding father of all-encompassing role-playing fantasy game systems, but there were other games that were coming out that had a more of a state-of-the-art game mechanics and things like that. And I think I also worked with a very, very talented game designer who's still in the industry right now, Dave Cook, Zeb, we called him, and he called himself. And I believe he had done the book before mine I think that was the Oriental Adventures. Forgive me, this was a long time ago, so my memory is not crystal clear on all this. But Zeb had done a book that started to expand AD&D first edition to include things like character proficiencies, beyond which, we all knew like thieves can pick locks and climb walls and stuff like that. But that was basically the only proficiency related game system in the original AD&D. And as you probably know, by second edition, that had been broadened considerably to include lots and lots of skills for all kinds of different characters. But I was very pleased and proud to be able to have a small step in that, in getting the proficiencies specifically as they related to things like not just thief climbing walls, but anybody trying to scale a cliff, trying to do some of the things that were necessary for getting through the underground. As far as actually learning about caves, in addition to touring some, I've toured well, there's big cave in Wisconsin I've been to since Blue Mounds, Cave of the Mounds, I've been going to since I was a kid. And then I toured Wind Cave in Colorado. There was another one in South Dakota. So I've done some of the caves that actually have tours, and I've always been fascinated by being in there. And I knew what the difference between a stalactite and a stalagmite, and how you get flowing flowstone and things like that. I'd actually seen them, but I picked up a few books, consulted some encyclopedias, and learned what I could about the actual science of that. Why the difference between a dry what they call a living cave and a dead cave is basically water. And some of the animals that learn to live, and plants that learn to live without sunlight, things like that were basically available the old-fashioned way, like going to the library.
Yeah, I feel like in the old like TSR days, it would have been like Gary going, "All right, who's been in a cave before? Yeah, all right, you're on this book."
Yeah, well, it wasn't exactly like that. It was by that time, Gary, of course, and Frank Menser was always working at his side, and they had done AD&D, and Gary was kind of moving into the he was spending a lot of time in California where they were trying to get a movie deal put together. So those of us back in Wisconsin were more or less, we had managers. This wasn't just a bunch of game designers sitting around and saying, let's do this. But I had the opportunity, I got assigned to write the book, not for any particular caving or spelunking experience that I'd had, but that I think I had kind of shown my chops as a game designer by then, as had Zeb, and they were willing to take a chance on us. And it makes me really happy to hear how you guys and other people in particular have really enjoyed this book and utilized it. Because I did not have a huge ton of self-confidence when I was writing it. I was hoping it would be useful. I was hoping it would be well received, but it's very gratifying at this. I'm 66 years old now. I was in my early 30s when I wrote it. So it's heartwarming, actually, I have to say, to hear you guys talk about it. I'm trying not to let it go to my head.
Yeah, I think after Lord of the Rings, the Moonshade trilogy might have been one of the first trilogies that I read. So like that was very influential to me. Like I've read a lot of your novels. I think like we were talking before, and Thyla was talking about, kind of express some of the similar stuff. Flint the King was one of my favorite Dragonlance books. It was the first like fantasy novel I've read that like was written with a lot of humor in it.
Yeah, Mary Kirchhoff and I wrote that together. It was Gully Dwarves. So
yeah.
That's comic relief right there.
So on this project, what are some of the challenges you guys have had to overcome?
May I?
Yep, go ahead, Tyler. Jump in there.
So one of the biggest challenges for me personally was that the way in which we play games has changed rather drastically since the second edition, because we had this hard break in third edition where the audiences of role-playing games essentially split. And a lot of people nowadays play D&D 5e as a kind of sequel to D&D 3rd edition, or Pathfinder for that matter. So they play it like a complex tactical combat simulator where you move your characters around, and it matters where the different areas of effect interject and stuff like that. They are really into the math and tactics component. However, there's also a significant amount of people who play more akin to how they used to play, for example, AD&D. So they don't care too much about complex rules. They want relatively simple rules. And so you always have this tightrope act when you're designing anything for 5e, or at least if you want to do it well. And so for me personally, as a game designer, one of the toughest spots was I wanted to make this book appeal to people who enjoyed the tactics and tactical combat and who wanted cinematic combat. You guys mentioned Oriental Adventures, which was one of the first supplements that had stuff for cinematic combat, right? And I wanted to introduce something like that for 5e as well, particularly for lower level 5e characters, and did so with a momentum engine where you can barrel into enemies and, for example, disarm them or strike their shield to the side so that your rogue body can properly knife them and stuff like that. And I wanted these engines to be super simple for the people who wanted it more on the simple side of things or who wanted to adapt the rules to another system, but I did not want to sacrifice the options and the appeal for other people. And so I tried to design the more complex parts of the system in a modular way so that you can just say, okay, I'm into the complexity. I want to track different degrees of momentum. I want to do that. You can do that and run with the system. Or you can just say, okay, I want it simple. I roll old school. You can do that as well. So for me personally, walking this tightrope that retains compatibility between those subsystems was pretty interesting and difficult, and I'm actually really proud of how it came out.
That's a real challenge. The playability versus reality, and or realism, I should say, not reality. But I think that I'd love to hear the emphasis you're taking on allowing players to take whichever option they wanted. Just to kind of move it along and have that action movie feeling of events going on, or if you really want to break it down. And as I did some of my later design projects were the battle system rules, where we took AD&D and turn it into a miniatures rule, where if you have 100 orcs led by 5 ogres and you're going up against a group of spearmen and a group of archers, you can resolve that as a battlefield using armor class and to hit probabilities and things like that without rolling 100 attacks for the 100 ogres and so forth. It is a real challenge, and I applaud you for taking it on so straightforwardly.
What was it like tackling this project, Douglas, from the narrative aspect?
Well, that was probably the most fun. I feel like I kind of came into role-playing gaming. I started as a dungeon master, and I came in as a storyteller. I wanted to be a writer. I had since high school. I'd wanted to write adventure. I wrote a lot of short stories. I did independent studies. And can I take a little autobiographical diversion here?
Yeah, absolutely. We're here for it.
I really enjoyed writing adventure stories. Then I got to college, and it's like, well, you know what? I'm not ever going to have a job writing adventure stories. I better train for a job. And so I got a teaching certification. I became a high school teacher. And my second year of teaching, I had a girl in my class. Her name was Heidi Gygax. And one day she brought me a pass. She said, I'm going to be excused. I need to be excused from class tomorrow because I'm going to be interviewed by People magazine. And I'm in a little town in Wisconsin. It's like, People magazine? What the heck? And she said, well, my dad invented this game, and which I had heard of Dungeons and Dragons. I'd never seen a copy or anything or knew anybody who played it. But I told her, wow, that sounds really interesting. So I think this was the next day she came back to class was a Wednesday, and she brought me a copy of the blue box basic D&D set. Just said, this is from my dad, maybe you'd find it interesting. So by Friday night, I had read the rules. I hadn't I took the dungeon that was right from the box, but I had invited a bunch of my friends over. We had about five players. We're all like in our 20s. None of us had kids, so it was a particular time of our lives where we had time to sit down and do stuff like that. And then I started a campaign that went for a good year and a half with the same players. A few more people joined in. And I obviously, after that first dungeon, I started designing my own adventures, mapping out my own settings and things like that. And it kindled that memory that I had of writing for fun, which I had been doing in high school, but not in college. And being a teacher, I had the summer off of school. And so the first summer after I'd been playing D&D, I thought, you know what, I'm going to try to write a fantasy story. And I sat down, I typed it up. I wrote about 2/3 of it over the course of the summer. And it was amateurish, first draft and everything like that. But I found that it was fun to sit at a typewriter and just create this story day after day after day after day. And then I went back to school. I learned one of my friends, Scali Sanchez, I'd brought into my group, and he had since been hired by Dragon Magazine. And I learned that the TSR, the company, of course, that was doing all the gaming at the time, was only 15 minutes away from my house, which I didn't realize. And then Gali called me up and he said, they're hiring game designers. This was in the autumn of 1981. And he said, why don't you take a stab at it? So I went through a series of job interviews, and it helped that I could bring in this 300-page manuscript and, plop it down on the desk and say, well, I'm working on this. And they could look at it and say, well, at least the guy can, put one page after another.
Yeah.
And they ended up hiring me. And so it was really my love of storytelling that brought me into the game design profession. And so when it came to doing Dungeoneer Survival Guide, the fact that I could incorporate, one of the things that I think made the book unique is that the last third of the book or so is that narrative description of a whole bunch of different regions of the Underdark, to me that was a huge appeal, and it was probably the easiest part of the book to write too. The game mechanics were fascinating and really an enjoyable challenge, but they're a lot more precise, a lot more, well, like Thilo said, math based. I'm not great at math, except I seem to have a pretty good gift for probability. And that's probably the kind of math that game designers most need to understand.
Are you still gaming? Are you still playing?
Very little. I have occasionally played some AD&D second edition over the years, maybe once or twice every few years. And when I game, I do military board games. The cardboard counters and hexagon games, which I've also designed some of those back in the day, and I still play a couple that I'm really proud of. And because of the computer now and the Vassal Engine program, which a lot of war gamers know, where you can actually, it'll load a war game map and counters onto your computer. So I play with my buddy in Indiana, and we used to play once a week till schedules interfered and stuff, but you can actually play a board game. It's like you're sitting at the table with somebody. So that's the kind of gaming that I found the most fun. Although, like I said, I enjoy some role-playing gaming, but I've never found an easy way to do that online, although I know a lot of people do. And so that's where I stand on that.
Yeah, nowadays pretty much everybody's gaming online for the most part.
Yeah.
What about you, Thilo?
Yeah, well, in the before the apocalypse happened, I actually played at least once a week, most of the times more often in different systems, but right now I'm pretty happy when I can play once a month and online at that via Fantasy Grounds, which for me personally is right now one of the most compelling virtual tabletops. What I wanted to add, if I may, to what Doug described is he laid out how the Dungeoneer Survival Guide had all these cool pieces of knowledge that were partially scientific and partially fantastic and blended together. And that is actually something that we also really wanted to achieve with the Survivalist Guide to Spelunking. So Stephen Yeardley, who unfortunately can't be with us here today, he did a ton, and I mean a ton of research on the taxonomy of caves, how they operate and stuff like that. And then he extrapolated from that, added some fantastic angles, and we worked from there. And one of the things that we also really wanted to do was to put the focus on the biomes, because as you mentioned, Doug, those caves per se, as the stars, and the underworld as the stars, was one of the things that made the Dungeoneer Survival Guide so fantastic back in the day, and why it still has this appeal for me, because it focuses on biomes and living in those biomes, right? And we didn't want to invalidate that, but we added, for example, fantastic biomes like fungal jungles, or
Yeah.
or weird crystalline landscapes where waves are frozen mid-splash, and where you can see strange hard-light phantoms of deceased people walking around and stuff like that.
You had me at fungal jungles. It's just fun to say.
Yeah, it is.
Oh yeah, and you can contact Shurumitis actually.
Um, yeah, I wish I would had this book back when I was running my Underdark campaign. It sounds like it would have been super useful at the time. Like there was some things you could kind of cherry pick from Out of the Abyss that had some coverage, but it's very very light. What would you say would be like some of the key elements for someone looking at this project? Is it gonna be useful beyond just like playing in the Underdark?
Most definitely. So if you're playing 5th edition and you think that, okay, I don't like this component that the player characters can heal up too fast. There is a method where the quality of the rest that you're getting actually affects your performance as an adventurer. So I devised a very simple system that rewards players for actually role-playing their characters. For after they trek through those desolate tunnels and climbed all day, they find this cavern, and it's full of beautiful iridescent and fluorescent moss, for example. What do players usually do? They say, oh my god, we're not resting there, it's a trap, monsters are coming, we'll just sleep in this harsh, unpleasant tunnel, right? Because, well, that's kind of what players are conditioned to do, to be paranoid, right? And so I, for example, wrote a system that actually rewards them for taking that plunge and sleeping in that moss-covered cavern. And there's a ton of stuff like that around. For example, there are modules and things that you can't really play or play well in all editions of D&D and a ton of other role-playing games. For example, I'm a huge sword and sorcery fan, so I like the old school Savage Sword of Conan comics from the 70s and 80s, right? Mm-hmm. And there's this trope of the lone hero wandering into the desert or into the taiga or some other inhospitable terrain. And they succeed where everyone else fails and dies and stars and is dehydrated and things like that. So I actually devised a combination of systems that if you implement them, you can play hex crawl. And civilization really matters. Civilization is essentially your ability to recharge your batteries after exploration. So the higher levels you get, the more powerful you get, the farther you can roam from civilization. So that explains why, for example, characters like Conan or a legendary dwarf or something like that can spelunk and walk farther than, let's say, a level 1 character who has the same constitution score, and without requiring monsters as kind of the things that keep adventurers where they're supposed to be in their level regions. So that's one thing. Or play huge caravans or an Exodus narrative where the people of a settlement are displaced by, for example, an army of aggressive drow, and they have to evacuate through endless tunnels. So if you want to play this caravan of people moving along and have some resource management there, that's also possible. So like the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, because that's what I got out of that book. I wanted to enable GMs to run adventure types, whole types of adventures that they can't with the default rules, or that they can't run well. Because that's what the Dungeoneer Survival Guide did for me. It enabled me to run proper underworld, underdark adventures.
So I want to jump back to you, Douglas, and ask you: is there any from the TSR days? Is there any particular characters you miss writing?
Well, Flint, as Thilo mentioned, that he was one of my favorites. We back when Gen Con, when all of us of the original Dragonlance team were still working there, Tracy and Margaret, and it's a whole bunch of us, Harold Johnson. We would do Readers Theater Dragonlance shows for Gen Con every year. And I always played the role of Flint. And not because I'm short, but because I could do that, you doorknob of a Kender kind of, it was a good, fun role to get into. So I actually felt a kinship to him because I had been reading his part in these dramatic performances. So I missed him a lot. Once we proceeded on beyond my first few books, I was writing about mostly new characters. I had a chance to do Fist and Dantalus as a Dragonlance book, both in the pre and the after days of his transformation. But he was always a little creepy, and there was some of the villains too, which were fascinating to write about. Ariakis, who was the first Dragon Lord and one of the generals of the dragon armies that first invaded Krynn, and I did his backstory, and I had to work to write a coming of age story for a truly evil character. how he started out as a regular person and became that. So that was always a little disturbing too. I again, thinking of what Thilo was talking about with Conan, in my reading experience, Tarzan was a character that I read all the books growing up, and there were a lot of heroic aspects. I think that the series doesn't age very well because the racial stereotypes are a little offensive, or more than a little offensive. And at the time, I wasn't really feeling that as a teenager. But the heroism of Tarzan and his really superhuman, his Conan-like abilities were part of what really drew me into fantasy, heroic fantasy. Trying to think of the characters that I've written about. Each of the trilogies I was able to do for Dragonlance. I did one about a cleric, one about a dwarf, and all the nation, the dwarven nations of, I think that was the name of the trilogy. It was either the Dwarf Home trilogy or the Dwarven Nations trilogy. I think we talked about calling it the Dwarf Home trilogy, and Margaret Weiss pointed out, well, that kind of sounds like some sort of rocket coating, like the dwarf foam. So we changed that. But so each of those had a protagonist that I was able to do, and I really do like writing coming of age stories, which is usually something that happens in the first book of a trilogy. And each of those trilogies had a character that I grew quite attached to during the course of writing the trilogy. But because of the nature of and as we referred to before, the pace that I was writing at, it basically would move on after a year and a half, well, 2 years, maybe probably about 2 years to write a trilogy of books. And then I would move on to doing something else. So I didn't ever grow overly attached to those characters, in the sense that 10 years later, I think back and really wish I could go back and revisit them.
The in the Meztica trilogy, like, I use that as an example of dual classing from AD&D all the time, because the main character started off as a wizard's apprentice and later became a warrior and joining this like legion, and then later like finds another spell book and kind of takes up the magic user mantle once again as well. Was that like intentional, like to to kind of like squeeze some of the AD&D rules into the game, or how did that come about?
Well, I mean, Maztica was Forgotten Realms territory, so it was functioning under the AD&D rules. It was, as you probably aware, the story was totally drawn from history. That Cordell was Cortez,
Yeah.
and because it always struck me is that the Spanish conquest of Mexico was maybe the closest thing to a real life Dungeons and Dragons adventure that ever happened, because you did have you had priests, you had warriors, you had certainly the people on the one side believed in strong elements of magic, which fortunately or unfortunately did not help them very much. So the chance to do magic interpreted as the Mesoamerican cultures, the Mayan and the Aztec cultures and the Proto-Aztecs believed in them, was really a fascinating challenge. I probably, more than any other fiction that I wrote, I really immersed myself in the actual history of those cultures. I read everything I could. I went with my wife for 2.5 weeks and toured the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City and the pyramids near Mexico City, and then going to the Yucatan and visiting Uxmal and Chichen Itza, and just being dazzled by these amazing structures that people built without metal weapons, without beasts of burden, and yet there's still towering monuments, and then thinking about the kind of magic that they aspired to, and working it into a story where it actually helped. I mean, there's not a lot in terms of the Aztecs, the way they treated other people. There's not a lot to admire about them, but it's also, you can feel sympathy for them in terms of the way they were completely obliterated by much more technologically advanced, although outnumbered, group of invaders who had things like artillery and horses and metal armor. And I remember reading the best first person account of the conquest is by a regular soldier, Bernal Diaz, I think was his name, who was in Cortez's army. And I remember one particular description of a battle where the conquistadors were fighting not the Aztecs, but the Tlaxcalans, which were a very, very powerful tribe that was between them on the coast and Tenochtitlan, or Mexico, which is now Mexico City, which was their objective. And they fought this day-long battle, and he had this vivid description of arrows showering down on them, and the armored conquistadors forming their, shoulder to shoulder and holding back thousands and thousands of the Native American warriors. And at the end, he said, it was a terrible battle. We had several men wounded. And just like underscored to me the total advantage that metal armor and metal weapons gave, considering that the Tlaxcalans were their weapons were their swords were basically wooden clubs that had stone obsidian edges, and they could be very, very sharp, but they would break as soon as you struck a breastplate or a metal gauntlet, the stone would break. And the arrows were all tipped with stone arrowheads. They were not that much of a threat, and I wanted to kind of even the odds a little bit in telling the story of Maztica, and also making the natives a little more sympathetic than the real, the level of human sacrifice that the Aztecs practiced was really appalling. I wanted to kind of make that culture more sympathetic and also have more of a fighting chance. So magic was a really good avenue to be able to do that.
Yeah. Although next to colonialism, I don't know that was that much more appalling in hindsight, right?
It's tough to say. I mean, I agree. There's that business of marching 10,000 people up a temple and cutting open their chests and pulling out their hearts and dumping the bodies down the back. It was just so mechanical.
Sacrifices had to be made. I just keep thinking about that. Sounds like an amazing business trip right off.
It was.
Your research.
Yeah.
Totally, yeah, probably the best one I ever had in my life.
By the way, fun fact, one of the psychological factors about the whole conquest of Mesoamerica was also there was this doomsday prophecy that said that some kind of superior species would come from across the seas and bring a total cataclysm to the people, which was extremely demoralizing for the forces arrayed against the conquistadors. So you also have a doomsday prophecy in there.
Yeah, you're totally right. That was Quetzalcoatl. In fact, the Feathered Serpent, which is the third novel in the Mazteca trilogy, is based on that god, the god of Mesoamerican, not just Aztec, but virtually all of Mesoamerican mythology. And the Quetzal is a bird with brilliant plumage, but they envisioned him as kind of a snake too. And so the Feathered Serpent was, and then when they saw the sails of the ships and people, aboard ships coming across the ocean, which they didn't have sail technology. They had large canoes, but again, they were just, this is Quetzalcoatl come to reclaim his land. And so that was, and they were also burdened by a really Moctezuma was not the right leader for the time, because he, like you said, he was totally paralyzed by this sense that they were up against gods and that there was really nothing they could do. Although they fought tenaciously, and the thing that really doomed them was smallpox. That one winter when they had fought and basically won and held on to their city, and the survivors of the conquistadors were perched on the hills outside of Mexico City, and then over the course of a winter, 3/4 of the population died, and then the Mexicans also, the conquistadors brought up more cannons, and just the final battle was just amazingly tragic and ugly, because they basically destroyed this one-of-a-kind city block by block by block just by advancing the artillery. And so it was tragic all around.
So spoilers for these books you wrote like 30 years ago, but one of my favorite scenes is when they are, I think it's a priest of Helm, they're sacrificing, and they cut him open and they're like reaching into his chest to pull out his heart, to cut out his heart. And you like depict this like contest between the gods themselves during that sacrifice. It kind of like, I don't have the greatest of memories, but that scene like kind of still resonates. It's be like super profound and powerful.
Wow. Well, thank you. As I said, that was really a one-of-a-kind writing opportunity also, because so much of D&D justifiably is born out of Northern European mythology, everything from the Swedes to the Germans to the English. The Mazteca trilogy, by the way, was my personal inspiration for that, was a wonderful series of books called The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander, which is, they're really written as a young adult series. They're not quite as weighty as the Lord of the Rings, as the Tolkien books, but they tell us magnificent story that's purely drawn from Welsh mythology, and that the whole idea of the folk, which were the main protagonists of the Moonshaes, were based on the ancient Welsh.
What were some inspirations for each of you when it comes to writing? I'll start with you, Thilo.
Oh boy, inspirations are essentially wherever I can find them. Sometimes it's a video game I'm playing, sometimes it's a book I'm reading, and sometimes it's just a certain vista I see when traveling or when hiking or something like that. I had some of my best ideas while camping in the wilderness and staring at a beautiful sunset, for example. On the other hand, I also had great ideas while reading some obscure strange authors that most people probably will never have heard about, or some more popular ones like Doug.
I would start with books. I think, as I mentioned, the Tarzan series, and then the other Edgar Rice Burroughs series, like the Mars, I really cut my teeth on those. And I got into Conan and Lord of the Tolkien. but as I said, it was really when I read the Chronicles of Prydain is what really, that's what got my juices flowing. And my first novel, the one that became Darkwalker on Moonshade, was very much inspired by that setting. A friend recommended Dune to me when I was about 17 years old. And it just blew me away how, what a profound epic it's a fantasy science fiction it could be. And I liked historical novels. I've read a lot of military history. I've been partly, I mentioned, I've done some military game design, and I have sort of a high level amateur background in military history, and reading things about the Battle of Waterloo or the I wrote a Dragonlance. It's a novella, not a whole novel, but it was based on how the dragon armies initially, how the good guys drew out the dragon armies that had conquered so much of Krynn, and the tactics of the whole war were based on the naval war in the Pacific in World War II, because I viewed the flying dragons with their dragon riders were like the air groups of the aircraft carriers. War basically took place on a broad plain, so there was very little terrain affecting the war, but you had big armies marching around, and then you had these extremely powerful mobile forces, which were the flying dragons, and they would go and they would fight the gold and silver dragons would fight the red and blue dragons in air battles. And then when one side would gain air superiority, they would just absolutely clobber the other side's troops on the ground. And that, it seemed to me that the carrier battles, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Lady Gulf and Marianas, were very much models that I built that whole military campaign on. So that was a very specific inspiration. I wrote another Dragonlance novella with a backdrop that was very much like the Battle of Waterloo, which had a Duke of Wellington character and a Napoleon character. The Napoleon was an ogre, and the Duke of Wellington was this haughty noble. And the battle didn't even figure in the story. It was the night before the battle, and this group of actors came in and set up a stage right between the two armies. And the two generals were like, wait, get these guys out of here. We got a battle to fight. But they ended up getting drawn into the performance. So the Battle of Waterloo was not part of the story, but it formed the backdrop of what still was one of my favorite novellas.
So are you still currently writing?
Yes, I've very, very much slowed down. My pace of Dragonlance. Well, Dragonlance ceased publication in the late 2000s, which many of us writers, including like Margaret, don't really understand why, but I think Hasbro decided to get out of the book publishing business. And they, of course, own Wizards of the Coast, which owns what used to be TSR. So that was my main source of income for 20 years, and it basically dried up. So since then, I've done some individual projects. I've written some military history. I had a chance to do a family biography called We Were Berliners, of a fellow who had read my books and liked my writing style, asked me if I would be interested in ghostwriting his grandpa's memoirs. His grandpa had been a Luftwaffe paratrooper, fought in the Battle of Normandy, and he started doing interviews with his grandpa, and his grandmother was there, and she chimed in, and he basically learned that they'd grown up in Berlin, so they were there before the Nazis. They saw the Nazis take over. They were kind of sucked into the war. She was in a bank working in Berlin that got bombed into oblivion, and then after the war, they struggled to survive and find food, and they ended up emigrating to Canada in about 1960. So they had a fascinating life story, and I was able to write that as a nonfiction book. I've written some alternate history military stories, and I'm currently, just a year ago, I was contracted by Ulysses, a German company, that they have a Ulysses USA branch, and they have a game system called the Dark Eye. Thilo probably is familiar with that.
Das Schwarze Auge, yeah.
Yeah, it's very, I understand it's very big in Germany.
It's actually more popular than D&D.
That's what they told me. That the story that I heard was that they approached Gary Gygax back around 1980 to see if he would authorize a German language edition of D&D, and he, for some reason, I can't understand it, but he said no. So they came up with their own game, and it's amazing. I mean, I've just the American translations I've seen. The maps are gorgeous. The character classes and creations are very, very elaborate, and they have an incredible amount of backstory. So I've been given the stories. I'm writing stories of some noble families that occurred in the century, like the 100 years preceding the actual current time frame of the current game environment. I'm working on the first book, but this might turn into a series. Hopefully, will turn into a series of several books. So that's my main writing project right now.
Are you starting to get an itch to come back to the gaming table?
You know what? I would like to go to some conventions again. You and I were talking about Gamehole in Madison.
Yeah.
That Alex Kammer, the fellow that started that, and he has got his own. He's got a restaurant, but way upstairs, he's got a place called the Gamehole, which is a room it's a good size office, and the walls are just totally lined with game modules and books. And he invited me up there the first time I went, and had a bunch of my things that I was pleased to be able to sign for him. And he single-handedly, he got me back into playing an adventure that I had written that I hadn't even thought of for 20 years. And he ran it at a convention, and I sat at the table and played it with a group of people, and that was a lot of fun. So I like the idea of sitting in and playing a game like at a table at a convention more than I like the idea of trying to run a campaign as a dungeon master. If that answers your question.
So, there's nothing wrong with that. Either side of the screen is fine. I'm sure anyone would be more than happy to have one of the legends of the industry sitting at their table for sure. Might be a little pressure.
It was funny. I didn't remember half the stuff. In fact, I didn't remember hardly anything from the module that I was playing in, even though I wrote it. It was one of the H series I wrote with Michael Dobson that we tried to, after Battle System came out, we wrote a series of high-level modules, 4 modules that started. The first one, Bloodstone Pass, was basically the story was a complete ripoff of the 7 Samurai and the Magnificent Seven, where 7 heroes come in and try to, a group of peasant village basically asks for these heroes to come and save them from a big army of outlaws. And it lended itself very well to using some mass combat battles and also some high-level characters taking on some big bad guys. And we ended up getting quite carried away with that. And so by the 4th module, you're actually going up against Orcus himself in the deepest pits of the Underdark. That was I think the highest level module. It was made for characters in the teens, level of like 14 to 16 and so on, that I think had ever been published to the time.
So Shallander in the chat just mentioned Talatis. Is that how you say it? From Dragonlance. It was one of the box sets, I believe.
Oh, that was like the world on the other side from Krynn, the Atlantic, the continent on the other side of Krynn, as I recall.
Yeah. Did you work on that?
No, I did not. I'm not even that familiar with it, except that the name rings a bell.
The only thing I really remember is like they had their own Minotaur empire over there, and they also had gnomes that were at war with like these fire elementals, and the gnomes had this one unit called, or knighthood or whatever you want to call it, Company of the Dead. And they were just so badass because once you joined the company, they would hold a funeral for you with your family and your friends, and you were considered dead to the rest of the gnome kingdom, except for amongst your brothers and sisters who were involved in this war. So I remember having that box set like a million years ago, and I was like, it was the first time I remember anyone making gnomes actually cool in D&D. Before they were always like, they're kind of like dwarves, but a little different.
Yeah, that I think that's an expansion of what Tracy Hickman is really the driving force, creative force behind the world of Kryn. And I remember that I think he called gnomes tinkers, and they were funny and creative, but prone to disaster. They were constantly experimenting, and they didn't really know what they were doing. And then he took halflings and he made them Kender, which were like again, they had so many characteristics that were unique to Kender that, I mean, sure, it was like playing a halfling character in D&D, but they were a unique race. Basically, their curiosity is what really set them apart. And so both gnomes and Kender in Dragonlance were great sources of humor. You could really draw a lot. You could get a lot of laughs out of
that and Gully Dwarves. Although it was like play a Kender if you hate your friends. Is kind of the deal.
They weren't always the most popular to have around.
I have kleptomania. I have to act like a total prick and get the whole party thrown in jail. Sorry.
That pretty much that kind of sums it up for sure. So how to kind of bring it back to the survivalist guide to spelunking for D&D. How has that project been for you guys collabing together and working on the team?
I found these guys really welcoming. We've corresponded in email extensively, but this is, as I said at the beginning, this is the first time I've seen Thilo face to face, and it's nice. I really enjoyed the collaboration. They did by far the lion's share of the work on this. I'd like to think of kind of my contributions as sort of window dressing or things that might again sort of break up the structure of a book that's very heavily rules intensive. So it was a fun ride for me, but it was not very hard. They also did the heavy lifting. Stephen and Thilo.
Personally, first of all, starstruck and totally humbled, and I actually chose the systems that I ended up using in the book based to a very large degree on what you wrote, on your prose and your narratives of Dugmore Dumble, and on all the fun facts and on the fun I had while reading them, because you actually managed to make me laugh out loud, not once, but several times. And that's really hard to accomplish with writing, for me at least. So
thank you very much. That I really was going for kind of a comic. I mean, I wrote about from the point of view of a character who had a very, very high opinion of himself. But then the actions that he described show that he was really kind of inept and maybe even not the nicest of dwarves.
So we are up on the hour mark. Final thoughts? Let's start with you, Thilo.
Well, first of all, Doug, it's been a huge, huge, huge honor working with you. I'm just still totally flabbergasted, and it's even more awesome to actually talk to you and soak in your wisdom like this. And thank you, Dave, for having us on your show, man. I absolutely appreciate it. And to all the people watching out there, I definitely hope you'll give us a shot. Check out the Survivalist Guide to Spelunking on Kickstarter and back us, because the book's really inexpensive for a massive, awesome hardcover. And I think you'll agree that it will be a book you'll keep using and using and using over the years and over the systems. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me too, Dave. This is, as you can tell, I'm kind of not involved heavily in the hobby anymore, but it is so nice to hear that stuff that I did all those years ago is still, people are still enjoying it and getting some entertainment value from it. And to think that there's a new product out there that at least traces some of its genealogy to my book is really, really nice to know. I have not had a chance to see the completed book yet myself, but I'm really looking forward to doing that.
Well, thank you both for coming on. It's been great chatting with you, and Douglas, getting your experiences throughout, throughout the, editions, and since the, the very beginning of the hobby, really has been really cool. And like I mentioned, you've been very influential on me throughout, throughout my life with a lot of your writing. So thank you for your contributions, and it was great meeting you as well, Philo. Both of you guys were awesome to chat with. You're more than welcome to come back anytime you'd like, and maybe we can meet up at GameholeCon sometime after the end of the world is done ending.
I'm sure Alex is going to have that going again. So yeah, let me know if you're coming to Madison. Nice
I will
to talk
do.
to you. Nice to meet you.
So until next time, everyone, stay nerdy.